My father sold our childhood home, with all our belongings inside, without telling us. When I told him it was mine, now, he smirked and said, "If you wanted it so badly, you should have bought it from me back then." I just stared at him. That was 11 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my office, yelling about elder abuse. My father sold our childhood home together with our belongings without telling us, so I bought it from the new owner, and his jaw dropped when I told him that he is not welcome. My dad has always been the kind of man who thinks, what's yours is mine. But somehow, what's mine is definitely not yours. Growing up, he treated our house, the one my grandparents left to both my parents, as if it were his personal trophy. He never asked anyone else's opinion on changes, and any repairs or renovations were done based on what would impress his friends, not what we needed. When I was 10, my brother and I begged him to keep the old oak tree in the front yard because we used to climb it after school. The next weekend, it was gone. Too much of a hassle to rake the leaves, he said. When my mom cried about it, he told her she was overly sentimental. By the time I was a teenager, I noticed a pattern. If something had emotional value to us, he didn't see it as special. He saw it as leverage. He'd threaten to throw out our keepsakes if we didn't do chores fast enough. Once, he boxed up all my mom's photo albums and put them in the shed for decluttering during a fight, and some got ruined in a storm. After my mom passed away, the house became even more precious to my siblings and me. It wasn't just four walls. It was the last piece of her we had. Every room held a memory. Family dinners in the kitchen, my mom sewing late into the night in the den, birthday parties in the backyard. I thought my dad understood that. Apparently, I gave him too much credit. One Saturday, I went to visit the house. I'd moved into my own place a few years earlier. I pulled up and saw a moving truck in the driveway. At first, I thought maybe he was getting new furniture. Then I saw strangers hauling boxes out. I walked in to find my dad casually sipping coffee in the kitchen, our kitchen, while two people I'd never seen before were carrying my mom's old rocking chair out the door. "What's going on?" I asked. He looked at me like I was interrupting him. "Oh, I sold the place," he said, like he was talking about selling a used bike. "Got a good offer. Didn't think it was worth bothering you with the details. Didn't think it was worth bothering me. About the house we grew up in. About the one thing my mom wanted to pass down to us." I asked him where we were supposed to get our things. He shrugged. I told the buyers they could keep whatever they wanted. Less hassle that way. I couldn't even speak. I just walked out. I didn't trust myself not to start screaming. For weeks, I avoided talking to him. Then, by sheer coincidence, I ran into the new owners at a coffee shop. They were a middle-aged couple who recognized me from old family photos left in the attic. They told me they'd bought the place as a fixer-upper, but they were planning to downsize in a few years. That was the seed of my plan. Over the next 2 years, I stayed friendly with them, sent holiday cards, dropped off cookies at Christmas, even offered to help them with small repairs. I never brought up buying the house because I didn't want to seem pushy, but every time I visited, I quietly took note of how much work they were putting into it. Then last spring, they mentioned they were ready to move closer to their grandkids. Before they could even list the house, I made them a fair offer. Cash, no real estate agents. They agreed. When I signed the papers and got the keys, I didn't tell my dad right away. Instead, I waited until the moving truck was gone, and I'd put some of my mom's old saved belongings that I'd managed to rescue from storage back into place. Then I called him and said, "Hey, wanna come over? I have something to show you." He walked in, took one look around, and froze. "What? How?" he stammered. I smiled. "You sold it. I bought it back. The difference is, this time it's not yours to sell." He tried to play it off. "Well, if you wanted it so badly, you should have bought it from me back then." I told him, "I wanted it back then. I just didn't want you to have a penny from it." The look on his face was the sweetest bit of closure I've ever had. Now, the house is mine. My siblings come over for Sunday dinners like we used to. We've planted a new oak tree in the front yard, right where the old one stood. And the best part? My dad has to drive past it every time he goes into town. A month after I moved in, I got a knock at the door. It was my dad. He looked around like he owned the place again and said, "So, when can I move into my old room?" I just stared at him for a second, then started closing the door, but he shoved his foot in the gap and pushed past me into the house. He walked straight to the living room and stopped at the mantel where I'd put back all of Mom's old family photos that I'd rescued from storage units and relatives. His hands were shaking as he picked up one of the frames and his face got red. He turned to me and said something about having no right, but I was already moving to block the hallway that led to the bedrooms. My own hands were shaking now, and I could feel that old familiar knot in my stomach from when I was a kid, and he'd get that look on his face. I told him this was my house now, but my voice came out weaker than I wanted. He actually laughed and pulled out his phone, swiping through old photos of himself in these same rooms from years ago, telling me a piece of paper didn't change 30 years of living here. I kept saying he needed to leave, but he just walked around touching things like he was claiming them. I grabbed my phone and called my sister Melissa, who taught at the middle school 10 minutes away. She must have heard something in my voice because she said she'd be right over. While waiting for her, I followed him room to room as he tested doorknobs and checked windows like he was doing an inspection. 20 minutes later, Melissa's car pulled up, and she came in still wearing her teaching clothes with paint on the sleeves. She positioned herself between me and Dad and used that same voice she probably used on rowdy 7th graders. Dad's whole expression changed from angry to something more calculated, and he started talking about how we were being unreasonable and family should stick together. Melissa didn't budge, and after another 10 minutes of him trying different angles, he finally left, but not before mentioning he'd be back. That evening, I sat in Mom's rocking chair that I'd bought back from an estate sale, and every little sound made me jump. I checked the locks twice, then again an hour later, then once more before bed. The next morning, I was getting my mail when Mrs. Anderson from next door mentioned that Dad had been telling people I'd manipulated the previous owners, the Holloways, into selling below market value. She had this concerned look, but also seemed to be keeping her distance like she wasn't sure what to believe. I called a locksmith that afternoon and spent $400 I really couldn't spare to change every lock on the house. The locksmith mentioned that someone claiming to be the homeowner had already called that morning trying to schedule the same service. That's when I realized Dad wasn't just angry, he was planning something. My brother Daniel called me that evening, and his voice had that careful, neutral tone he used when he didn't want to pick sides. He told me Dad had been at his auto shop all morning telling anyone who'd listen that I was having some kind of breakdown and needed help. Daniel warned me that Dad was working on getting other family members on his side. 2 days later, I was eating lunch in my car at work when Dad showed up in the parking lot and started yelling loud enough for everyone to hear about his ungrateful son, locking him out of his family home. My co-workers were staring through the windows, and my supervisor Sarah had to come out and ask him to leave. Later, she pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, and I could tell she was worried about how this might affect the office. By the third day after that confrontation, I couldn't focus on my code at all, and kept making stupid mistakes I hadn't made since I was a junior developer. My performance review was coming up in 2 weeks, and I needed this job to pay for the house. I realized this was exactly what childhood felt like. Dad creating chaos that affected every part of our lives until we gave in. Melissa called me that night to tell me Dad had been calling our extended family with his version of events. Our Aunt Carol had called Melissa worried about my mental state and suggesting maybe I needed professional help. The story Dad was spreading was that I'd stolen the house through manipulation and was now having delusions about ownership. That same week, I went to the electronics store and bought 4 security cameras. I installed them myself around the house, one at the front door, one at the back, 2 covering the driveway. The guy at the store asked if I was having break-in problems, and I couldn't explain that I was scared of my own dad. Every morning before work, I'd check the camera feeds on my phone. During lunch breaks, I'd check again. My coworker noticed me staring at my phone during a meeting and asked if everything was okay. I just nodded and put it away. 3 days after installing the cameras, I came home to find dead roses on my doorstep. They were wrapped in newspaper with a note in my dad's handwriting that said, "For your mother's memory, which you're disgracing." My hands shook as I picked them up. The roses were completely black and dried out. I threw them in the trash and went inside, but couldn't stop thinking about them. That evening, I drove to Melissa's apartment, and she showed me her laptop screen. Dad had made a Facebook post with pictures of our house, claiming I'd manipulated grieving widowers and committed elder abuse. There were already 43 comments. Most people were offering him sympathy. This whole situation feels like there's layers of history we're not seeing. The way his dad just casually sold their childhood home makes me wonder what their relationship was really like before Mom died. Our cousin Jake had written that he'd come talk sense into me. Aunt Carol said she was praying for our family. Even people I didn't know were calling me horrible names. I sat at Melissa's kitchen table and started typing a response. Then I deleted it. I typed another one. Deleted that too. Every version sounded defensive or crazy or bitter. Melissa watched me type and delete 15 different responses over the next hour. Finally, I closed the laptop. Any response would just make Dad's story seem more real, but staying quiet felt like letting him win. A week later, my phone rang while I was at work. It was Grace Holloway, the daughter of the couple I'd bought the house from. She said her dad had seen the Facebook posts and was reconsidering the sale. She sounded sorry, but firm. Her dad thought maybe Bob had been forced into selling and wanted to check if everything was legal. I left work early and drove straight to a lawyer's office. The lawyer looked through all my paperwork and said everything was completely legal and solid. But then he leaned back in his chair and told me that public opinion mattered. He said my dad was building a case in the court of public opinion, and that could affect my life, even if the law was on my side. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, I walked through the house room by room. In the living room, I could almost see Mom reading on the couch, but I could also remember Dad throwing her books away when he was mad. In the kitchen, I remembered Mom baking cookies, but also Dad smashing plates during arguments. Every room had 2 versions fighting in my head. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a battleground. The next morning, Daniel showed up at my door. He never visited without calling first. He sat at my kitchen table and told me Dad had come to his shop with a locksmith. Dad wanted Daniel to sign papers saying I was mentally incompetent. Daniel had refused. This was the first time he'd ever stood up to Dad about anything. His hands were shaking when he told me. He said Dad had screamed at him in front of his employees. 2 days later, I got a call from Linda Morrison. She was Mom's best friend from way back. She said she needed to see me right away. When she came over, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter in my mother's handwriting. Linda said Mom had given it to her before she died, knowing Dad would try something like this. The letter was 3 pages long. Mom wrote about all the times Dad had hidden money, manipulated bank accounts, and lied about finances. She wrote about him threatening to sell the house whenever she disagreed with him. She wrote about finding secret credit cards and hidden debts. At the bottom, she'd written, "Protect the house, Nathan. It's the only thing I could leave you that he couldn't take while I was alive." I sat alone in the kitchen where Mom used to bake and read her letter 3 more times. Every word felt like she was sitting next to me. She'd known this would happen. She'd tried to protect us even after she was gone. 2 weeks later, I was eating breakfast when someone knocked on my door. The woman standing there had a badge and a folder thick with papers. She said she was from Adult Protective Services, and they'd gotten a complaint about me taking advantage of some older people named the Holloways when I bought my house. My stomach dropped. She needed to see all my bank records, the sale documents, every email I'd ever sent them. I spent the next 3 hours digging through files while she wrote notes about everything. She asked how I'd convinced them to sell to me instead of using a real estate agent. She wanted to know if I'd pressured them or made promises I didn't keep. Every question felt like she already thought I was guilty. The next day at work, my boss called me into his office. He said my performance review was being pushed back because of some recent issues issues that had come up. Someone had been calling the company about me. He looked uncomfortable and wouldn't meet my eyes. He asked if everything was okay at home. I knew exactly who'd been calling. That evening, Melissa called me, upset about something she'd found out. She'd run into Tom Holloway at the hardware store and he'd been cold to her. When she asked what was wrong, he said my dad had been visiting him every week for coffee. Dad had told Tom that I'd tricked him into selling below market value and that our whole family was suffering because of my greed. Tom believed every word. The APS investigator came back 3 days later with more questions. She went through every detail of how I'd met the Holloways, how often I'd visited, what gifts I'd given them. She asked if I'd ever suggested they not tell anyone about our private sale agreement. She wanted to know why I'd paid cash instead of getting a mortgage. Her tone stayed professional, but I could feel the suspicion in every question. She said this was standard procedure, but her eyes said she thought I was exactly the kind of person who would scam old people. After she left, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. I couldn't make myself go inside. Every room in that house felt poisoned now. The kitchen where Mom used to cook felt like evidence of my supposed crime. The living room where we'd had family meetings felt like a courtroom. The garden she'd loved felt like stolen property. I turned the car on and drove to a motel instead. 3 days later, my supervisor called me in again. This time, he closed the door and pulled the blinds. He said HR had been getting calls from someone claiming to be my father, saying I was mentally unstable and might be a danger to the company. He had to ask me directly if I was seeing a therapist. He said he didn't want to ask, but legal made him. My dad had crossed into my professional life now, trying to destroy my career just like he'd threatened when I was a kid. That afternoon, Grace Holloway showed up at my door without warning. She looked confused and worried. She said her dad wanted to sue me for something called fraudulent inducement, but she remembered how happy I'd looked when they'd sold me the house. She said my dad's story about me manipulating them didn't match what she'd seen with her own eyes. She offered to testify if I needed her to, then left quickly like she was afraid someone might see her there. I started keeping a journal that night, writing down everything that happened each day. I realized I was starting to question my own memories, wondering if maybe I had done something wrong. Each entry started with the same 3 words to remind myself this was real. This really happened. I wrote about the house sale, about Mom's letter, about Dad selling our home without telling us. This really happened. I wrote it over and over. At the grocery store a few days later, I saw 3 people from our old church. They'd known my family for years. When they saw me, they turned and walked the other way. One whispered something to the others. I found out later that Dad had started going to services again after years of not showing up. He'd been telling everyone about his ungrateful son who'd stolen the family home through deception. He called me his prodigal son who'd lost his way. The congregation was split, but most believed him because he cried during his testimony. Daniel called me that night, excited about something he'd found. While cleaning out his garage, he'd discovered an old phone with saved voicemails. One was from Dad 2 years ago, right after he'd sold the house. In the message, Dad was laughing and bragging to Daniel about finally getting rid of that money pit. He said the maintenance was killing him, and he was glad to dump it on some suckers. Daniel had already made copies and sent one to Melissa. The therapist's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. Nothing fancy, but I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing it. She listened to my whole story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow pad, and when I finished, she set down her pen and told me my father was using something called DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim, and Offender. Having a name for what he was doing made my chest feel less tight for the first time in weeks. Linda called me that same afternoon with a folder she'd been keeping for years, filled with emails my mom had sent her about the house. In one from 3 years before she died, Mom wrote that she was scared Dad would sell the house out of spite after she was gone, because he couldn't stand that her parents had left it to both of them instead of just him. Linda had printed everything and made copies for my lawyer. 2 days later, I was eating breakfast when a process server knocked on my door with papers showing Dad had filed a civil lawsuit against me for intentional infliction of emotional distress and conversion of family property. My hands shook as I read through the claims, each one more ridiculous than the last, but my lawyer said even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend. I had to write him a retainer check that wiped out half my emergency fund. Melissa showed up at my door that night with red eyes and shaking hands, and as soon as she sat down in the kitchen, she started crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. She kept saying he was doing it again, making us question what was real, just like when we were kids, and I realized we were both having the same physical reactions we'd had as children when he'd gaslight us about things we knew were true. My lawyer called me the next week after taking Dad's deposition, and he could barely contain his disbelief at the lies Dad had told under oath. Dad claimed he'd offered me the house first, that I'd refused to buy it, that all the belongings he'd sold were worthless junk nobody wanted. Every single claim was provably false with the emails and witnesses we had. I spent the next 3 days creating a timeline document with every contradiction Dad had told different people, and the pattern that emerged was clear as day. Dad's playing 3-dimensional chess while everyone else is stuck playing checkers, except his pieces keep changing their stories every time he moves them. That's quite the strategy for someone supposedly concerned about family values. He'd told the pastor I'd stolen from him, told his golf buddies I'd manipulated the sale, told his brother I'd threatened him, each lie designed to turn someone against me. My lawyer looked at the timeline and said we were building a solid harassment case. The security cameras I'd installed caught something that made my skin crawl when I checked the footage one morning. Dad's car was parked across the street at 2 a.m., and he was just sitting there in the dark, watching my house. The next night, he was there again at 3 a.m., the third night at 1:30 a.m., each time just sitting and staring for 20 or 30 minutes before driving driving away. I was making coffee when another process server showed up, this time with papers from Tom claiming fraudulent concealment, saying I'd hidden the family dispute to trick him into selling me the house. Now I had 2 lawsuits draining my bank account, and when Grace called me crying and apologizing for what her dad was doing, I could hear Tom yelling in the background that she better not be talking to me. The knock at the door a week later sent my heart racing so hard I thought I was having a heart attack, my whole body going into fight or flight mode, even though it was just a delivery driver with a package I'd ordered. I sat on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes trying to breathe normally, realizing Dad had made me feel unsafe in the one place that should have been my sanctuary. Daniel called that evening with news that made him angrier than I'd ever heard him. He'd gone to check on the memorial fund we'd set up for Mom's bench at the park and discovered Dad had been withdrawing money from it for months to pay his legal fees. The account that was supposed to honor our mother's memory was almost empty because Dad needed money to attack her children. Daniel said he was done being neutral and asked what he could do to help. I told Daniel to gather any proof he could find about the withdrawals while I dealt with something else that had just come up. The next morning, the APS investigator called to say their investigation was complete. She wanted to meet in person to discuss the findings. When I got to her office, she had a thick folder on her desk. She pushed it toward me and said the investigation had cleared me completely. Not only that, but she'd found evidence that my dad was the one doing the exploiting. She'd interviewed Tom multiple times and discovered Dad had been visiting him regularly, telling him lies about me. Tom had shown her emails from Dad claiming I was planning to sue all the neighbors. The investigator said she'd documented everything as potential elder abuse by Dad against Tom. She gave me a copy of the official report for my lawyer. 2 days later, my therapist brought up something I hadn't thought about. She suggested I start recording any interactions with Dad for my own protection. She explained that people like him follow predictable patterns and recordings would help others see it too. I bought a small voice recorder that same afternoon and started keeping it in my pocket. The next week, Grace showed up at my door looking upset. She had a copy of the APS report in her hand. She'd confronted her dad about the lawsuit after reading it. Tom had admitted he was having second thoughts, but felt trapped because he'd already signed papers with Dad's lawyer. Grace said Tom was starting to see how Dad had manipulated him, but didn't know how to back out now. While all this was happening, I decided to clean out the attic to keep myself busy. Behind some old boxes, I found a small notebook with cartoon stickers on it. It was my diary from when I was 12. Reading through it made my hands shake. Page after page described the same things Dad was doing now. The threats to throw away my things if I didn't obey. The lies he told about Mom to make us take his side in arguments. One entry from my 13th birthday said he'd promised to let me have friends over, then canceled at the last minute to punish me for not cleaning my room fast enough. The patterns were all there, written in my kid handwriting with misspelled words and doodles in the margins. I photographed every page and sent them to my lawyer. By the 10th week of this mess, something surprising happened at work. My supervisor called me in for my monthly review. She said she'd noticed major improvements in my performance lately. The breathing exercises my therapist taught me were helping me stay focused, despite everything. She removed the performance warning from my file, and even mentioned I was being considered for a project lead position. At least one part of my life was getting back on track. The following Tuesday was Dad's deposition for Tom's lawsuit. My lawyer was there as an observer and texted me updates. Dad apparently forgot his own lies because when asked about the house sale, he claimed he never wanted to sell it. The court reporter had to read back his earlier testimony where he'd said the opposite. Dad tried to argue, but the damage was done. His lawyer looked frustrated and asked for a break. My lawyer said Dad's contradictions were now part of the official record. Meanwhile, Linda had been busy too. She'd contacted a bunch of Mom's old friends from her book club and church group. Many of them remembered how Dad had treated Mom and were willing to help. They wrote statements about things they'd witnessed over the years. One friend described how Dad had taken Mom's car keys to stop her from going to her sister's funeral. Another wrote about finding Mom crying because Dad had emptied their joint account without telling her. Linda organized all these statements into a binder for my lawyer. The stress was really getting to me by this point. I hadn't slept a full night in weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I had nightmares about losing the house. In the dreams, Dad would be standing in my living room, laughing while strangers carried out Mom's furniture again. I'd wake up covered in sweat and check all the locks. Melissa noticed the dark circles under my eyes were getting worse. She made me promise to see my doctor about sleeping pills. The judge handling Dad's lawsuit finally had enough of the family drama and ordered everyone into mediation. The mediator was an older woman who'd been doing family disputes for 20 years. Within the first hour, she caught Dad in 3 different lies. She wrote everything down in her notes. When Dad tried his sob story about being abandoned by his kids, she asked him specific questions he couldn't answer. She asked why he'd sold the house without telling us. She asked about the memorial fund money. Dad kept changing his story, and she kept writing. Her final notes said the family dysfunction seemed to stem from one person's need for control. 3 nights later, I woke up to my phone buzzing with a security alert. I grabbed it and saw someone on my front porch camera. My stomach dropped when I recognized Dad trying different keys in my door. When none worked, he moved to the side door, then the back. The cameras caught him trying to jimmy open a window near the garage. He spent 20 minutes going around the house before finally giving up and leaving. I saved all the footage to multiple drives. In the morning, I had to decide whether to call the police on my own father. The next morning, I drove straight to my lawyer's office with the security footage on 3 different USB drives. She watched it twice, took notes, then picked up her phone and started making calls. Within 2 hours, she'd filed a countersuit against my dad for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. She listed everything he'd done since I bought the house, including the attempted break-in, the false police reports, and his lies to family members. She asked for damages to cover my lost work time, therapy costs I'd started needing, and all my legal fees. My dad had spent months trying to destroy me, and now we were using his own tactics against him. 3 months into this mess, I got a call from Grace Holloway, the woman who'd been helping my dad with his campaign against me. She asked if we could meet at a coffee shop downtown. I almost said no, but something in her voice made me agree. She showed up with a folder full of recordings on her phone. Her hands shook as she played them for me. It was my dad coaching her father Tom on exactly what to say in court, promising him he could get the house back for him if Tom just followed his script. In one recording, my dad actually laughed about how easy it was to manipulate a lonely old man. Tom was sitting next to Grace, and his face went red as he listened. He looked at me and said he was sorry, that he'd been so lonely after his wife died, and my dad had seemed like such a good friend. Grace said they'd both been used, and she wanted to help make it right. That weekend, Melissa and Daniel came to the house for dinner, our first family gathering without Dad. We cooked Mom's old recipes, the ones she'd written on index cards that I'd found in a box Dad had tried to throw away. Daniel brought wine, Melissa brought dessert, and we sat at the dining room table where we'd had so many meals as kids. We raised our glasses to Mom's memory and promised each other we'd never let Dad divide us again. The next Monday, I went back to work full-time for the first time in months. My boss had been patient with all my court dates and lawyer meetings, but I knew I needed to focus. Turns out, dealing with my dad had actually made me better at handling difficult clients and office politics. When a stakeholder tried to bulldoze our team in a meeting, I stayed calm and redirected just like I'd learned to do with Dad's attacks. 3 weeks later, my boss called me into her office and offered me a promotion to senior developer. Tom filed paperwork withdrawing his lawsuit the following week and gave my lawyer a sworn statement about how my dad had manipulated him. Something about Dad trying different keys in the middle of the night feels really calculated. Makes me wonder if he kept copies from before or if he's been planning this break-in attempt for a while. He came to my house to apologize in person, bringing cookies his daughter Grace had baked. We sat on the porch and he told me about losing his wife, how my dad had found him at the grief support group at church and slowly worked his way into his life. Grace and I started texting after that, sharing stories about how my dad had played us against each other. 2 weeks later, my dad sent an email to every relative whose address he had, including cousins I hadn't talked to in years. He'd attached what he claimed was proof of my mental illness, including photos he said showed me having breakdowns and medical documents proving I was unstable. The photos were obviously doctored, with my face badly photoshopped onto someone else's body. The medical documents had typos and wrong dates. My Aunt Carol called me laughing, saying Dad must really be desperate if this was his best shot. Even relatives who'd stayed neutral started reaching out to say they were done with his lies. My lawyer immediately subpoenaed Dad's financial records as part of our countersuit. What we found was even better than we'd hoped. He'd been claiming the house on his taxes for the past 3 years, taking deductions for property tax and maintenance, even though he hadn't owned it since he sold it. The IRS doesn't mess around with tax fraud. My lawyer said this wasn't just a civil matter anymore. Federal authorities would be getting involved. I walked through the house that night, seeing it differently than before. Instead of remembering Dad's angry footsteps in the hallway, I heard Mom's laughter from the kitchen. Instead of seeing the spots where Dad had punched walls, I saw where Mom had hung family photos. Every room I'd restored felt like taking back a piece of our real family history, the one before Dad's anger poisoned everything. The house wasn't his shadow anymore. It was Mom's light, and it was ours. 4 months into this whole conflict, I got a call from someone at Dad's church. They wanted me to know they'd asked him not to come back. Too many members had compared notes and realized his stories didn't add up. He'd told different people completely different versions of why I'd stolen his house. When they'd confronted him about the contradictions, he'd blown up at them, and that was the final straw. His attempt to use his faith community against me had backfired completely. That weekend, Melissa came over to help me install a new security system with cameras that covered every inch of the property. But we also planted Mom's favorite flowers in the garden, the pink roses she'd always loved, and the lavender she'd dried for her dresser drawers. Melissa helped me pick out perennials that would come back every year on their own, just like Mom used to plant them. The house needed to be protected, but it also needed to be beautiful and alive, not a fortress. Monday morning at work started normal until the receptionist called saying someone was making a scene in the lobby. I took the elevator down and found my dad standing by the security desk, his face red and his voice carrying across the marble floors. He was telling everyone who would listen that I'd stolen his house and left him homeless at 58 years old. The security guard looked uncomfortable as my dad pointed at me and started yelling about elder abuse and how his own son had robbed him. People stopped to stare, and several pulled out their phones to record the whole thing. My dad saw the cameras and got louder, saying I'd manipulated him when he was vulnerable and taken advantage of his trust. Security finally stepped in when he tried to push past them toward the elevators. They walked him out while he kept shouting that this wasn't over, and everyone would know what kind of person I really was. My boss watched from the doorway and told me to take the rest of the day off to handle whatever this was. The security team filed an incident report and banned him from the building permanently. 3 days later, my lawyer called with good news about the countersuit we'd filed for harassment. The judge had reviewed the security footage from my workplace, along with all the threatening texts and voicemails my dad had left. She issued a temporary restraining order that afternoon, requiring him to stay 500 feet away from both the house and my workplace. The court papers arrived at his apartment that evening, according to the process server. That weekend, Daniel came over to help me fix the back fence that had been damaged raged in a storm. We were hammering new boards when he mentioned he'd started seeing a therapist 6 months ago. He said talking about our childhood had helped him understand why he always felt anxious around authority figures at work. We sat on the porch steps, and he told me about realizing how Dad's mind games had affected both of us differently. Daniel said his therapist helped him see that Dad's way of being a man, never showing weakness and always needing control, wasn't the only way. We made a promise that afternoon to raise our future kids differently, to let them feel things and make mistakes without fear. Linda called the next morning saying she'd found something while cleaning out the attic storage boxes I'd asked her to go through. It was another letter from Mom, this one in an envelope marked "For my children," and dated 2 years before she died. The letter was handwritten and notarized at the bank, making it legally valid according to Linda. Mom wrote that she wanted us kids to have the house after she was gone because it held our family memories. She specifically mentioned being afraid Dad would sell it out of spite if she died first, since he'd always resented that her parents left it to her. Linda scanned the letter and sent it to my lawyer immediately, who said it would strengthen our case significantly. 5 months had passed since this whole mess started when Thanksgiving rolled around. I decided to host dinner at the house like Mom used to, inviting Melissa, Daniel, Linda, and surprisingly Grace showed up with a pie. We set the table in the dining room with Mom's good china that I'd bought back from an antique store after finding it there. The meal felt peaceful, everyone sharing stories and laughing. Our chosen family gathered in the space we'd fought so hard to protect. My dad drove by twice that evening, slow enough that we could see his car through the window, but the restraining order kept him from stopping. Grace mentioned she'd seen him parked down the street earlier, but he'd driven off when she walked toward his car. The next week brought a new development when my dad hired his third lawyer, who tried a different strategy. They filed a claim of elder abuse, saying my dad at 58 was suffering from mental decline, and I'd taken advantage of his condition. The court ordered a competency evaluation by an independent psychiatrist, which my dad apparently thought would help his case. The evaluation took 3 sessions and included cognitive tests, interviews with people who knew him, and a review of his recent behavior. The psychiatrist's report came back stating my dad was completely mentally competent and showed signs of deliberate manipulation rather than any decline. The report actually hurt his case by documenting his pattern of calculated attempts to regain control through various legal strategies. My therapist had been taking detailed notes during our sessions about the family dynamics I'd described over the months. She provided a professional report to my lawyer documenting the patterns of psychological manipulation that went back decades. Her report showed how my dad's current behavior, the threats, the public scenes, the legal harassment, matched exactly with the control tactics he'd used throughout my childhood. The judge found this evidence compelling, especially combined with the psychiatrist's evaluation showing Dad was fully aware of his actions. One night I realized I'd slept straight through until morning without waking up anxious for the first time in months. The house felt different now, warm and safe instead of like a battlefield where I had to stay on guard. I made coffee in Mom's old Percolin that morning and sat on the porch watching the sunrise. The thought hit me that I wasn't winning this fight by becoming like my dad, angry and vindictive, but by staying myself. My strength came from the support system I'd built and the boundaries I'd learned to set, not from trying to control everyone else. A reporter from the local news station called that week, saying my dad had contacted them with his elder abuse story. She wanted to hear my side before running anything, so I met her at a coffee shop with my lawyer present. We showed her the documentation, the psychiatrist's report, the restraining order, and Mom's letter about the house. She spent 3 days investigating, talking to neighbors, reviewing court records, and interviewing people who knew our family. The story that aired wasn't what my dad expected at all, since it focused on elder exploitation, but with him as the perpetrator, not the victim. The piece included interviews with experts on financial abuse of elderly parents by adult children who refused to respect boundaries. Public opinion shifted fast after that, with people who'd seen his workplace meltdown video recognizing him from the news story. Then came the night that changed everything again. I woke up at midnight to loud banging on the front door and windows, someone yelling incoherently outside. Through the security camera, I could see my dad stumbling around the porch, clearly drunk, kicking at the door and demanding to be let into his house. I called 911 immediately while Melissa grabbed her phone to record everything for evidence. The police arrived within 10 minutes and found him trying to break the lock on the back door with a screwdriver. They arrested him on the spot for violating the restraining order, attempted breaking and entering, and public intoxication. Grace bringing pie to Thanksgiving dinner after everything her family went through is peak kill them with kindness and carbs energy. Bet that was the most awkward yet delicious dessert ever served. The arrest became part of the public record, searchable by anyone who Googled his name, which seemed to matter to him more than the actual charges. 6 months passed with the criminal case moving through the system faster than I expected, and my dad's lawyer kept pushing him to drop the civil suit and work out a deal, but he wouldn't listen to anyone who suggested he might lose. The prosecutor told me they had enough evidence to put him away for up to a year if he got convicted on all counts, which included the restraining order violation, attempted breaking and entering, trespassing, and harassment charges from all the documented incidents. My phone started ringing with calls from aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years, each one starting with some version of an apology for believing his lies about me being ungrateful or manipulative. My Aunt Carol called crying one afternoon to tell me about the time he'd convinced her to loan him money for Mom's medical bills that she later found out never existed, and my Uncle Pete shared how Dad had turned the whole family against him when he questioned why Dad was selling Grandma's jewelry right after she died. These conversations kept happening over weeks as more relatives reached lashed out, sharing their own stories of manipulation and lies, and slowly the family started talking to each other again, instead of just through him. Melissa, Daniel, and I drove out to Mom's grave on a Sunday morning with fresh flowers, and we stood there in the quiet cemetery telling her how we'd saved the house, how we'd kept our promise to her, and Daniel placed his hand on the headstone and whispered that the house would stay in the family forever. The next week, Dad's lawyer filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences, after Dad apparently screamed at him for suggesting they accept a settlement offer where Dad would drop everything in exchange for no jail time. Dad tried to find another lawyer, but 3 different firms turned him down after reviewing the case files, and he ended up having to represent himself, which the prosecutor said was the best thing that could happen for our side. I spent a whole weekend repainting my old bedroom, rolling primer over the fist-sized hole in the wall from when he'd punched it during one of his rages when I was 16, and with each stroke of the brush, I felt like I was erasing the bad memories and making the space mine again. My hands still shook every time a car slowed down outside, though, and I'd catch myself checking the window even when I knew he couldn't come near the house. Then the IRS got involved after someone, probably Grace from the Holloways, reported that Dad had claimed the house sale as a tax-free gift to avoid capital gains when it was actually a regular sale, and suddenly he was facing federal tax fraud charges on top of everything else. Grace and I spent hours working together on a statement for the court about how he'd manipulated both our families, how he'd played us against each other while lying to everyone, and the prosecutor said our united front would make it impossible for him to claim he was the victim. I realized one morning that I hadn't checked the security cameras in 3 days, hadn't felt that constant need to monitor every angle of the property, and it hit me that I was actually starting to live in my home instead of just defending it. A month later, the court ordered mediation for the criminal case, which meant Dad would have to sit across from me with a mediator and court officials while they went through all the evidence of what he'd done. The mediation happened in a small conference room at the courthouse, and for the first 2 hours, Dad kept trying to spin his victim's story about how I'd stolen his house and turned everyone against him. But the mediator just kept putting document after document in front of him, showing the harassment, the violations, the lies to police. Then something in him just snapped, and he started screaming about how he deserved respect, how the house was his reward for putting up with us, how we were all ungrateful parasites who owed him everything. And the mediator was recording every word while the court reporter typed frantically to keep up with his rant. The mediator called for a 15-minute break while security stepped closer to my dad's chair. 2 weeks later, my lawyer filed the summary judgment motion with all our evidence attached, including the recording from that mediation session. The stack of documents stood 8 inches tall on the judge's desk. My dad's lawyer kept trying to argue technicalities, but the evidence was overwhelming. The APS report showed clear financial exploitation attempts. The arrest records documented his harassment. The security footage proved every single incident we'd claimed. While the legal case moved forward, I decided to reclaim the house completely. On what would have been my mom's 65th birthday, I invited all her old friends over for a memorial dinner. Linda Morrison brought 3 photo albums I thought my dad had thrown away years ago. She'd rescued them from a garage sale he'd held without telling us. The house filled with stories about my mom's kindness, her volunteer work at the library, her famous apple pie recipe. For the first time in months, the rooms felt warm again. Daniel came over the next weekend with his truck full of tools. We spent 2 days building a workshop in the garage, something my dad never let us do because he said it would lower property values. We didn't talk much while we worked, just measured and cut and hammered in comfortable silence. When we finished, Daniel hung up the old pegboard from our grandfather's shed that I'd saved from storage. 3 days later, my boss called me into his office looking confused. My dad had called claiming I'd threatened to kill him and demanding they fire me for workplace violence. My boss showed me the security footage from my dad's previous visit to the building. He'd already reported it to the police as continued harassment. The detective added it to the growing pile of violations. The summary judgment hearing arrived faster than expected. The judge spent 40 minutes reviewing the evidence while my dad sat there turning redder with each document. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. She dismissed his lawsuit with prejudice and ordered him to pay my legal fees plus damages. The total came to $53,000. My dad's jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. His lawyer started gathering papers quickly while avoiding eye contact. 8 months after this whole mess started, my dad stood in criminal court for his harassment charges. His new public defender convinced him to plead no contest to avoid jail time. The judge gave him 2 years probation with strict conditions. He couldn't come within 1,000 feet of me, the house, or my workplace. Any violation would mean immediate jail time. That night, I went through the house removing all the interior security cameras I'd installed. I kept the outside ones, but packed away the inside equipment. My hands shook a little as I took down the last camera in my bedroom. I didn't need to live in fear anymore. 2 weeks later, Melissa called to warn me that Dad was telling everyone at his favorite bar that I was planning to sell the house for profit. She'd heard from 3 different people who said he was trying to get them to pressure me about family loyalty. I drove straight to my lawyer's office and set up a family trust with Melissa and Daniel as co-beneficiaries. The house could never be sold without all 3 of us agreeing. When Dad heard about the trust, he tried calling my siblings to turn them against me. They both blocked his number. The IRS letter arrived at his apartment in September. They'd completed their investigation into his tax fraud regarding the house he'd claimed to own for 5 years. He owed back taxes on the imputed rental income, plus penalties and interest. The total exceeded $80,000. His neighbor told Daniel that Dad had to sell his condo and move into a studio apartment across town. The final probation probation hearing happened on a cold Tuesday morning. My dad had to formally acknowledge his harassment in open court as part of his plea agreement. He read from a prepared statement in a flat voice, never looking up from the paper. The words meant nothing, but the legal requirement was satisfied. I sat in the back row feeling empty rather than victorious. His power over our family had finally evaporated in that sterile courtroom. I walked out to the courthouse lobby and saw my dad leaving with his lawyer through the glass doors. Our eyes met for maybe 3 seconds before I turned toward the parking garage. He looked smaller somehow. His shoulders curved forward like he was carrying something heavy. That evening, Melissa and Daniel came over with Chinese takeout, and we sat around the kitchen table like we used to when Mom was alive. Daniel pulled out graph paper and started sketching ideas for turning the basement into a game room for his kids. Melissa wanted to repaint all the bedrooms in colors Mom would have picked. We talked about hosting Thanksgiving this year and inviting all the cousins who stopped coming after Mom died. Nobody mentioned Dad once. The next few weeks felt strange without all the court dates and lawyer meetings filling my calendar. I went back to my regular work schedule and started seeing my therapist every other week instead of weekly. Weekend dinners with my siblings became our new routine, and sometimes I'd realize I hadn't thought about Dad for days. 6 weeks after the court hearing, a thick envelope arrived from Dad's lawyer with a return receipt required. Inside was a 10-page handwritten letter from Dad filled with accusations about how I'd ruined his life and vague threats about what he'd do when his probation ended. My lawyer filed it as evidence and got the restraining order extended permanently without me even having to go back to court. The mediator just sitting there calmly recording while Dad screams about being owed respect for putting up with his own kids makes me wonder what else he's said behind closed doors all these years. Spring came, and with it the 10th month since that first confrontation when Dad asked to move back in. Melissa found a small oak sapling at the garden center, and we planted it together in the front yard on a Saturday morning. Daniel's kids helped pack dirt around the roots while we told them stories about the original tree we used to climb. The sapling looked tiny compared to what used to be there, but the nursery said it would grow 3 feet a year if we took care of it. That December, we hosted our first real Christmas gathering since Mom died 8 years ago. Aunt Carol brought her famous sugar cookies, and Uncle Pete set up his model train around the tree just like when we were kids. The house filled with voices and laughter and kids running up and down the stairs. My cousin mentioned she'd heard through the family grapevine that Dad had moved to Arizona to live with his brother after his probation travel restrictions lifted. The distance felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. In February, I finally tackled Dad's old study, which had sat untouched since I bought the house back. I pulled out his heavy, dark furniture and donated it to Goodwill. Then I painted the walls bright yellow, the exact shade Mom had shown him in a paint sample 20 years ago that he'd called ridiculous. I set up an easel by the window and hung Mom's watercolors on the walls. She'd always wanted an art studio, but Dad said it was a waste of space. Now every time I walked past that room, it felt like choosing her vision over his control. By the 1-year mark of buying back the house, everything had settled into a new normal. I'd sit on the front porch my grandfather built with his own hands and watch the neighbors walk their dogs. They'd wave and stop to chat about the weather without that awkward look they used to have when the police cars were always showing up. The house had become just a house again, not a battlefield or a symbol or a fight to be won. One afternoon, while reorganizing the kitchen cabinets, I found a wooden recipe box shoved behind the mixing bowls. Inside were all of Mom's handwritten recipe cards, including the one for her famous Sunday roast that she made every week when we were kids. I bought all the ingredients and spent Saturday afternoon following her careful instructions about browning the meat and adding vegetables at just the right time. The smell filled every room just like it used to, and when Melissa and Daniel arrived with their families for dinner that night, we all stopped in the doorway for a second. Daniel's daughter asked why it smelled so good, and Melissa told her it was Grandma's recipe while blinking back tears. As we sat down at the dining room table with 3 generations gathered together, I realized I'd become the keeper of the good memories now. The house stood as proof that some battles are worth fighting not for revenge, but for the right to heal in peace. Thanks for letting me drop my clever little observations along the way. Stay sharp out there, friends. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.